Welcome to today's session of the Foreign Affairs Committee. Today we are hearing from Salome Zourabichvili, the 5th President of Georgia, as part of our inquiry on disinformation diplomacy. President Zourabichvili, thank you very much for joining us today. We were expecting to host you in person, but you have been unable to be here due to the ongoing situation in Georgia. I wondered if you could tell the committee and those watching what sort of situation Georgia is currently in at the moment.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, and thank you for your invitation to attend the committee, and I would certainly have been very glad to attend physically the committee, which gives the possibility of more direct contacts. If it were not for the current situation, which every day brings new repressive laws in Georgia, and especially these days, there are the political leaders of some of the parties that are the pro-European parties that are in the coordination that we have just set up were called in the prosecutor's office with criminal charges because they supposedly did not take part in some investigation from the parliament, and that's part very clearly of the political struggle, fight that is going against civil society on one side, political parties and political leaders on the other side, and the protest movement as such. To go back to the
I'm very sorry, Madam President. It's technical problems on our side. I understand that it's not possible to turn this up any louder than it is, and your voice drops slightly. So we have a lot of people here in the room, but also online. And I wondered if it was possible. I'm so sorry. I'm going to need to ask you to speak unnaturally loud because the sound is not quite good enough. That's great. Yeah, that's really good. Okay. Thank you.
So to go back to the origins, to just describe the situation, we had elections last October that were very clearly in everybody's eyes, and all the observation missions that were here, and more as time goes by we discover new details that just confirm what large sophisticated manipulation operation we had, clearly inspired, supported by Russians and Russian methods during those elections. As a consequence, the political parties declined to enter the parliament, which they don't consider as legitimate. The parliament met in non-constitutional forms against the letter of the constitution, and very shortly after the election, less than 1 month later, the prime minister, also considered hence as not legitimate, made a statement to declare that he was stopping the discussions on the European path of Georgia with the European Union. Both situations, first the manipulation and rigging of the elections, and even more so the statement made by the Prime Minister, started a huge mass protest in Georgia that is going on up to today.
How long have the mass protests been going on? How long have the mass protests been going on?
5 months if we start counting since the elections, and 4 months exactly if we start counting since the statement of the Prime Minister.
Are they every day, or are they once a week, or how often do they take place?
Every day.
Every day.
They are every day. And yesterday, for instance, which was the symbolizing the anniversary of the 31st of March 1991, when Georgia, with more than 90% of the voters, expressed voters, recognized and demanded independence. So it was a very important date in that sense. And we had the massive protest that counted many thousand people. Now I cannot have the exact count. So these protests are going on. They're going on in different parts of the country. They're touching different segments of the country, because practically everybody is in one way or another under the repressive laws. To describe the situation, not only this manipulation of elections and the statement of stopping really our path, which is supported by more than 80% of the population for the last 30 years, practically in all opinion polls and votes. We have seen very quickly after this statement the continuation and acceleration of what happened already last year, which was, and you have probably heard about it, the Russian law, which is a copy of what Russia has been doing to suppress civil society in Russia. Except that in Georgia, this process is going extremely fast, and practically every other day we have new laws that are also copies of what Russia has been doing, and methods that are very similar with repression, violence on the street, with hijacking people in their homes, in subways, and then they disappear and they reappear in some police station or in some jail.
Is there any estimate as to how many people have been arrested as a result of the demonstrations?
All in all, there were about 400 people that were arrested at different times, some under administrative offenses, some under criminal offenses, despite the fact that this protest has been absolutely peaceful and without any either demand of something that would not be peaceful or any actions that were not peaceful. And about 50 of those are still today in prison, and they are under criminal offenses, and that could range from 7 to 11 years for something nobody knows what really they have done, but it's qualified as group violence and things like that.
So it's qualified as group violence, is it? So, sorry, it's qualified as group violence, and that's why people are being arrested.
Group violence for some of them, resisting police, police actions for others, and arrests. And there are many different qualifications. But all in all, they're treating like criminals people that are very well known in the society. There are some of them young artists, young musicians, and all the pictures and videos that have been taken of this protest in these 125 days are showing that it's absolutely peaceful. So it's very difficult to sustain those accusations, but that is sustained because we do not have a justice system anymore in Georgia.
Right. Before we move, before we move on to details about what's happened I just wanted to kind of set the scene generally, so that if someone was watching this for the first time and didn't know anything about Georgia, they would think, why do we have this woman who's in Georgia? What is going on in Georgia? So that's very helpful for you to have set this out in the way that you have. But what I'd like to do is move on to Blair, who has some questions particularly.
Thanks. And just Chair to draw of interest. Can I ask President Zuraishvili, the violence on the streets and the violence in the prisons, the pressurisation of civil society, the seizing of assets, everything we're seeing in Georgia at the moment we saw 5 years ago in Belarus. And I wonder if it's your view that Ivanishvili is following the Lukashenko playbook, and if he is, could you imagine a world where the Georgian people accept de facto Russian control rather than just control of 20% of Georgia?
Well, first of all, I would say that yes, it's the same playbook as in Russia, and as in Belarus. To give an example, only today the Parliament adopted 3 different laws. Of course, there is no debate at all in the Parliament. The law goes through the 3 stages of the committees in just 3 days. One is the so-called American FARA law, which is just a new Russian law that gives more powers to the authorities to limit and constrain the non-governmental organizations. The second one is one that introduces in the criminal code, reintroduces what existed during the Soviet time, which is a state treason article. The third one is one that restricts the medias and imposes on them additional restrictions, both on financial control and on control of content. And there are also some side laws on the public service that ask now for the public servants to get authorization of their immediate superiors if they want to have any educational activities. All of that happened just in one day. So that gives the rapidity in which this playbook, which clearly is not written in Georgia, is implemented by a very conciliatory parliament and government, because they represent, all of them, only one party and one man, Mr. Ivanishvili. It is also important to note that at this stage in Georgia, there is not one single independent institution. All of the institutions have been taken over by the one-party rule. They are nominating their own people. And that's true of the courts, of the Supreme Court, of the Constitutional Court. It's true of the Central Bank that we have seen yesterday having an official meeting with the Chinese Central Bank. It's true of all the regulatory commissions that has one, among others, to regulate the media. So it's a complete takeover of the state. The president's institution was the last independent. They tried an impeachment procedure on me last September, but that was the last independent institution. So that is the stage in which we are. To say whether we are going to become Belarus or not, I think there is a very important difference, which is the stage in which is the civil society here, the characteristic of the Georgian civil society that has been very resilient. Even during the Soviet times it was resilient, and even before that during other times of Georgian history. So there is a different characteristic of the Georgian population. There is a very vivid still civil society and non-governmental organizations that are resisting, and they have been resisting twice to the Russian law, and they will continue with the FARA law, and they will find alternative ways. And there is the fact that the situation is different, because it's Georgia is a country that has been completely dependent and also sustained by our European and American partners that helped us to create and reform the police here, the army, and all the institutions were supported by our partners. And currently, the government is completely isolated by all these partners that continue to have with us, with the opposition, with myself, constant links. And so we are not abandoned.
So I think, I'm sorry to cut across you, but I think that I think Alex had some questions, particularly about what would happen if Georgia lost its links with the West, and what the government would do if it became isolated. I wonder, Alex, would you mind picking that up?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, President Zurabishvili. I suppose my first question, carrying on from Blair's, was about the Georgian Dream Party. So, of course, you were supported by Georgian Dream back in 2012. I wonder if you could just say a little bit about how that party has developed over the last 13 years.
Well, it's not the last 13 years, because I would say that since they came to power in 2012, they were behaving in accordance with what was their program. And their program was to continue on the track of pro-European, pro-Euro-Atlantic integration Georgia, to the point that it was this ruling party and majority that introduced in the parliament in 2018 the article which says that every institution in Georgia has to do its utmost to support the Euro-Atlantic integration path of Georgia, and that has become, as a common objective of all the forces and all the institutions in Georgia. And by the way, that's the article I invoked when I was defending my trips in Europe at the time of the impeachment, because I am requested by the Constitution to do what I was doing at the time. So there was a change very clearly. There was a change that started showing around 2021, right after the COVID situation, where maybe as a result to the erosion of power, clearly Georgian Dream started taking steps to consolidate its own power, and that entails to restrict some of the freedom of the media or of justice. But that was a slow and almost imperceptible movement, which accelerated very clearly with the war in Ukraine. And then we start having directly a very anti-Western, anti-European rhetoric, saying that Georgia is not going to participate to the sanctions policy, saying that Georgia thinks that its partners are trying to set a second front, to open a second front in Georgia to fight Russia, that they are not going to accept that, accusing our partners, European and American, to be part of a global war party. That's the time when we see the Georgian Dream attacking directly the American ambassador and some of the European ambassadors for their statements. Each time somebody is somewhat critical of their positions or actions. So that is what happens very fast, starting in 2022.
Thank you. And in your view, why was there such a pivot from being a very pro-European party to being then suddenly a pro-Russian party?
Well, one can ask. Maybe it was a superficial pro-Europeanity that was fine as long as there were no challenges. And as soon as there is a challenge, as there is the obligation to have a choice, that is maybe when our neighbor Russia starts putting more pressure on the people on which it can put pressure. And obviously, Mr. Ivanishvili is one of those persons on which Russia has some instruments of pressure. I would not know which, but I can only look at the facts and the rapidity again in which Georgian position moved 180 degrees. So sometimes I'm accused by the Georgian Dream telling me, well, we have supported you and you have changed, you have been traitor to the objectives of the Georgian Dream, and my answer is never. I was pro-European, pro-Western before you, and I stayed after you, and I've not changed anything, but you have changed quite a lot. And really it's a 180 degrees change, where the Russian propaganda is taking a major importance in the country. Global war, deep state, all of that we've heard for 2 years, 3 years. Anti-LGBT propaganda as coming from the West, from the Europeans, and as being imposed to Georgia against its values or whatever. So practically the handbook is not only in terms of implementing the laws and the methods of Russia or Belarus, as you want, but also their rhetoric and their propaganda. And very regularly now, the last, again, 2-3 years, we are complimented, we as Georgia and the Georgian leaders are complimented by the Kremlin for making the right statement, taking the right positions, so also calling in China for discussions on the port of Anaklia, and it seems that these discussions are quite advanced, but we don't know anything about it, about Tbilisi airport, the same Chinese partners. All of that shows that Georgia has taken a different foreign policy at the same time as it has taken within Georgia a very autocratic or neo-totalitarian policy. We even have Titushkები, which those that know the Russian regimes and the Belarus regimes, are those police forces that are not police forces, that are informal police forces but have some form of uniform, and are those that are really carrying out all the direct violence. They are not identified against all the conventions to which we have adhered, and hence are not reprehensible for anything because they do not formally exist.
Thank you, President Zurabishvili. I just wanted to ask you a question, which is how would you characterize the role of Bidzina Ivanishvili in Georgian politics?
Well, he was this informal hand in Georgian politics from the very time when he came in, at some times acting directly, being the prime minister, other times retreating and saying he would never come back, then coming back in. What is clear today is that he is taking all the decisions. The people that are left, because one has to see also that Georgian dream was depleted along the years from all the people that were truly pro-European, pro-Western in their ranks, and there were many that were the traditional Georgian politicians, because at the beginning the Georgian dream came as like a large coalition that was there to defeat the previous regime that had also turned quite authoritarian, but not pro-Russian. So this large coalition comported many people that were very truly pro-European, and over the years they left this coalition. And so by now it's a very small, turned inside Georgian dream that we have, with very little, I must say, intellectual capacities, and where clearly there is one man, one decision, because everybody, the 90 members of parliament that are sitting in this monocolor parliament, as well as all the ministers, or all the people that are spokesmen for the party, they all speak the same message box. There is not one single different statement on any issue, even on issues that are not very directly political, where there could be a different expressed opinion from one of them, but that has not happened in the last 2 years. It's a monolith, absolute monolith, and the one that decides is very clearly Mr. Ivanishvili. Nobody even challenges that.
May I ask you a follow-up question about Mr. Ivanishvili, which is, I believe that he was sanctioned by the US authorities in late last year, and the European Parliament has also initiated recommendations to EU member states that they freeze his assets. Now, according to my briefing, Transparency International Georgia have estimated that if the UK imposed sanctions on him, his entire business empire would fall apart, because he has holding companies in 2 British overseas territories, the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands. Am I correct in understanding that the UK government has not sanctioned him? And if that is the case, do you know why that hasn't happened?
Well, that last question, I certainly do not know why. What I can tell you is that, yes, Mr. Ivanishvili has, although I do not know the exact list, but has assets in the offshore islands, not only in the British offshore islands, but in others. It's evidenced by the fact that he has, and it also evidences the fact that he takes the decisions. He has made the parliament to adopt what is called an offshore law, which allows Georgian citizens to bring back from offshore islands or countries to Georgia without any dues or any verification their assets. So he has benefited from that. He has used this law, which was adopted just 3 months ago, and he has already repatriated his artwork collection worth what was announced publicly, $500 million. But it might be the case also that he has repatriated other things which we not necessarily know about. And that law, which is very dangerous, and at the time I vetoed it, also my veto does not pass the unanimity of the parliament. I vetoed it because it allows anybody that would tomorrow become Georgian, any potentially sanctioned oligarch anywhere in the friendly country of Mr. Ivanishvili, to use that same law to bring it to Georgia without any dues and without any verification to know what your customer, where those assets come from originally, to bring that to Georgia. So it really makes Georgia as a possible gray zone for the future in very organized manner. And that, together with the fact that we have seen what was quite a careful policy at the beginning about sanctions towards Russia, where Georgia was publicly saying that it was not going to adopt the sanctions, but was in conformity with the international financial sanctions. Gradually, Georgia has gone away from this strict policy and is by now used as a circumvention platform for many of the goods that go to Russia. And there too, the central bank, and for me, surprisingly, it has not drawn many criticism from outside. The central bank president has adopted a regulation last year, at the end of last year, saying that the sanctioned Georgian citizens were not going to be considered as sanctions by the central bank and should not be considered as sanctions by the Georgian banks if that was not, and if the proofs sustaining their sanctioning were not sustained by the Georgian courts, which we know the independence of. So that's really opening a huge loophole, especially that the nationality, awarding the nationality now that I'm not the one holding this capacity as a president, is very easy for today's leaders of Georgian Dream. So that's a huge loophole, and it also putting the Georgian banks that have been very strict in their application of the international financial regulations and sanctions, putting them in a very awkward position, because they have either to accept the regulation of the central bank or they have to isolate themselves. So they have not been put yet in front of that situation because none of the sanctioned persons had bank accounts in those two major Georgian banks on which depends Georgia's financial stability. So they have not been put in front of this contradiction in terms. But that might happen any day. And that gives also the dimension of the problem we're in.
I just want to just draw people's attention to the time. We've got, we have a lot of questions, and I know that members have many questions that they want to ask, but if it would be possible to keep the questions a little bit shorter and perhaps the answers a little bit shorter.
And my answers.
We'll get through it. And I wonder, and I'm so sorry to keep asking you to do this, but would you mind sort of leaning forward a little bit into your microphone, because also some of your answers are very interesting, but I miss a bit of it, and it might just be me, but I fear it might not be. So if I might just pass it on. Alex, do you have any other questions?
Yes. Thank you, Madam President. You talked about the Foreign Influence Law and the US-inspired Foreign Agents Act. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about the impact that would have on civil society and the media in Georgia.
Well, the intent, and possibly it can have the same impact as it has had in Russia, to really bring the civil society, these media and non-governmental organizations close to closing down, because they will not have any financial support. If they refuse to declare themselves as agents under one or the other of the laws, they're also susceptible of being under criminal offenses, so they are also susceptible to be fined or to be put in jail under those punishment sentences. So, of course, first of all, it frightens everyone. Secondly, it has a very disruptive effect, which we have seen during the elections, because those NGOs that have been traditionally those that organized the observers' missions, that were working to also train the observers and the commission members and so on, were directly under those attacks. They didn't know they were going to be fined, to be closed down, what was going to happen to them during the whole spring period. And so they found themselves at the eve of the elections in a way not as prepared as they would have been in other conditions. So it's a very dangerous, it's a sword of Damocles over the civil society.
Right.
Thank you.
Ed.
Thank you, Chair. Madam President, Russian interference in Georgia obviously predates the most recent crisis. I'm interested in the 2008 Russia-Georgia conflict, and to what extent you feel like the response by the UK, by Europe, by the West was appropriate given Russian aggression, and whether or not you believe that the response influenced Vladimir Putin's future actions in the region?
Clearly, yes. I think that, and that has been over history, even at the previous time during Imperial Russia. Georgia has always been ground for experimentation for Russian imperialism. So what happened in 2008 was that the new, in brackets, Russia, experimented military aggression against Georgia. It was not completely successful. They found many flaws in the military strategy at that time. Of course, their operation was in part successful, but not the whole. And certainly it was not successful to stop Georgia's path towards Euro-Atlantic integration, if that was the objective. And but what they saw is that even if it was not completely successful, that did not raise many protests from the Western world. Not enough, at least. The Baltic countries, the Polish president were there, protested, but not enough to make Russia believe that for Russia that would represent a major problem. And so they continued in Crimea. Of course, meanwhile, there was a major review of the military equipment of Russia and the military strategy, and then they went on to Crimea, whereas again, Russian propaganda managed to change a bit the narrative, and the reaction of the West was not that one-voiced as it should have been. And then we get to 2022. Now what happens now is that Russia, for itself, it might not admit it to the outside, but for itself has to recognize that military intervention does not succeed. That again, and to a very wider dimension, Russia had many problems with its military strategy, did not fulfill its military objectives, neither in 3 days, nor in 3 months, nor in 3 years. So, and it has cost a lot in military equipment, in prestige outside of Russia. It has cost to the point that they had to bring North Koreans, which for Russians must be very humiliating to be dependent on North Koreans to fight again instead of pure Russians. So all of that shows to Russia that this military intervention strategy is not the best one, and maybe is not the only one. Now we have an alternative, and again, Georgia is the ground for experimentation. The alternative is to manipulate elections. The alternative is to have a proxy government, an oligarch or a group of people, depending, and that is not costly. That does not raise any major uproar of the Western countries. Russia doesn't have to pay that in terms of sanctions because it's not visible. If it doesn't work, you can retreat easily, like it's the case in Romania. After the TikTok strategy, it has not worked. Well, we'll try something else, something different. But Georgia is clearly the experimenting ground. And if it succeeds, and it has not succeeded yet, That must be very clear. We're still there, we're still fighting, I'm still there, I'm not going anywhere. That's the difference with Belarus.
So to that point, Madam President, to that point about having to pivot to a different strategy, I'm interested to understand, because obviously we did see Russia occupied Crimea, we've obviously seen Russia activity in Moldova and other countries. To what extent has Russia been able to influence Georgian politics through the breakaway states of South Ossetia and Abkhazia? Has that given it any leverage? And is that the lack of leverage the reason why it's had to pivot to other approaches?
I think it has not given any leverage. It's a very touchy, difficult, sensitive problem for all the Georgians. Those two occupied territories that we all suffer, but we suffer in silence. And it has not given leverage because it has not brought Georgia to its knees. It has not brought Georgia to say no to the European path or to the Euro-Atlantic NATO integration path. So that means that it has not been effective, because that's probably the main objectives of Russia in Georgia, is to prevent Georgia to become part of the Euro-Atlantic community. It's to prevent...
I'm sorry, Madam President, are you effectively saying then that when those two regions in Georgia were annexed, it was a form of intimidation by the Russians? It was essentially saying, unless you stop, we're going to take over the whole country, and that hasn't worked.
Well, it might have been only to say that we have two occupied territories and you will never recuperate them if you do not change your policy and you do not behave.
Yes.
But we know by experience, because that has happened before, we know by experience that these supposedly carrots that Russia is sending to some Georgian leadership never work. They never go back, they never recede. So that does not work, and the Georgian path towards the European Union, first of all, has not only continued despite the fact that we have tanks 40 kilometers from Tbilisi, but it has accelerated. Accelerated thanks to Ukraine, thanks to the reactivity of the European Union to the Ukraine situation. And that has probably triggered the accelerated, increased pressures of Russia on whoever was under its control in Georgia.
Yes, I see.
Do you think...
My apologies for interrupting.
That's right, don't worry. Madam President, I'm just wondering if at a time when we are talking about the possibility of negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, is there a lesson that Ukraine should learn from Georgian negotiations with Russia?
From Georgian negotiations with Russia, we had negotiations that were successful to stop the war, Sarkozy coming in as a mediator, but they were not successful to solve the situation of the occupied territories. They didn't withdraw the Russian army, so it was a very small success, I would say. But one lesson that should be learned for Ukraine is that never accept to hold elections as long as the territory is under partial occupation, under the threat of war, because very clearly when we hear, just a few days ago, Mr. Putin set out its policy that is directly derived from Georgia. He said, in Ukraine, let's have a neutral administration, democratic elections. Why does he call for democratic elections? We don't know. And then we will discuss the peace talks. That means that the manipulation of elections, the way they had them in Georgia, finding an oligarch in Ukraine must be also possible. And then you have the same scenario applying to Ukraine in a country where, yes, the population is very much united around Zelensky, but probably after a time you might see emerging people that would be under the Russian propaganda, useful for the Russian propaganda.
And Ukraine is obviously also seeking EU membership and NATO membership. You earlier were outlining the importance of the Euro-Atlantic pathway. Is membership of those two organisations, in your mind, the only true deterrent to Russian aggression?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. That's nice and simple. Can I just move on to John?
Madam President, can I focus specifically on the elections last October? You've been very clear you regard them as illegitimate. You've referred to them as complete falsification, and international observers condemn them. But you've also called them a Russian special operation. Can you say why you regard them as essentially manipulated by Russia?
Because it was preceded by an intensive work of propaganda by the Russians, because it was accompanied by Russian propagandists that were on our territory, and we know how they have been working, because they were using during the elections a multiplicity of different methods of frauds, all used at the same time, but in different manners in different regions. We had 3,500 call centers that were used to oversee the voters and control the votes of people that had been put under pressure. To put people under pressure, the private individual informations were used, from which the person that was in charge, a neutral authority, again, an independent agency, was removed a year before in order to put that agency controlling and protecting personal information under the control of the one party. And those informations that are key to any election in Georgia, who has health problems and will need public financing, who has somebody in jail, who has some contacts with foreign countries, all of that was used in a very systematic manner. Well, there is no organization in Georgia that is able to think the scenario in such a way by itself without any outside support, and even to execute it maybe to some point, but certainly not to conceive it in its very wide dimension.
You've described various forms of electoral malpractice, but do you have any direct evidence showing that that was being run by Russia?
Of course I do not. I do not have at my hand the secret services or any services of the Georgian state, who should be the ones controlling that and those that should have this information. I don't know whether our partner countries were observant to the point that they might have those information, but we have lived long enough in the shadow of Russia to know when Russia is planning something. And I think that for those that still doubt what has happened in Romania or what has happened in Moldova and was saved in one case by the Constitutional Court, which we do not have anymore. It was very well thought. In the second case in Moldova, it was saved by the diaspora. Well, everything was done, and I was directly involved as the president to try to open pressings in our diaspora, which is very numerous, 1 million abroad, on 3.5 Georgians. Those 1 million were prevented by very many different means to really be able to exercise their right to vote. In the end, only 17,000 could vote. That shows the extent to which this was operated and really controlled and manipulated.
Before we move on, I've just to pass on some information to you. Whilst we've been hearing evidence in the main chamber of Parliament, the Home Office, the British Home Office, has been making a statement about the implementation of the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme, and have made it clear that we believe that Russia is a threat to our country and is seeking to introduce regulations to curtail Russian influence in the UK and ensure that there is proper registration of various bodies attached to the Russian state, and Russia is stated specifically as a country which is a threat to ours. We are responding to the whole of the state, the whole of state threat Russia poses, and then goes into the details. I just thought that would be, I mean, literally, as you've been asked about the influence of Russia within your country and within elections, we're making statements in our parliament about the need to curtail Russian influence on ours.
Yes, I think that it's something, the novelty of the new hybrid strategy of Russia versus the military aggression is that it can reach anywhere. In the case of military aggression, it was countries around its borders. But now, with this hybrid strategy, this electoral strategy, accompanied by a number of propaganda and laws, that can happen exactly in any other country which would be chosen by Russia as an object of its hybrid strategy. And I don't count, of course, the cyber attacks that we were also imposed. Me personally, the presidential administration was under attacks 3 times over the last year and a half.
Yes.
And also an element that was proper to Georgia was the immigration of a number of Russians following the war against Ukraine,
Yes.
which came to Georgia, about 100,000 immigrants. That brought quite some input in the economy, hence the good figures that we've had for some time, thanks to the money that they brought in Georgian economy. But there was no control on those Russians that came in at all. They're benefiting of a 1-year visa that can be renewed just by passing the border. So it is really a huge army where I think that the big majority are people that are absolutely innocent of anything, but it still allows for many activities in Georgia that are not controlled.
Yes. Uma.
Thank you, President Zurabishvili. It's been really fascinating to listen to your insights. We've seen that there's clear evidence of sustained hybrid warfare being conducted in Georgia. How has the disinformation been used to promote anti-Western narratives? And what support have you received from the West, the UK, EU, the US, to provide, to counter the pro-Russia narrative?
In that sense, I think we have received no support. There was no clear strategy to counter the Russian strategy. We have seen this propaganda that some of us looked at the beginning as almost hilarious, that they were trying to say that our friends, supporters for the last 30 years were countries that were trying to throw us in a war, that they would be responsible for the war if it were to happen, when the whole Georgian history shows that the only responsible ever has always been Russia. So we didn't believe that this propaganda would work. And that was very effective to a certain point, because it allowed people, in fact, that were supporting for different personal interests and others, supportive still of this regime, to be able to say to themselves and to others, no, I'm not pro-Russian, and I'm not supporting a pro-Russian regime. It's just that I do not want war, and I'm supporting a regime that avoids war in Georgia. And so in that sense, it has been an effective instrument. And in that, we have not been able to design or to prevent it at a time when it was happening, counter strategy. And I don't think that there has been a real policy of supporting us to counter this strategy.
Thank you. That's quite alarming to hear that from you. What today's announcement that we've just discussed, the fact that the UK government has said Russia presents an acute threat to UK national security, and we are calling Russia out and putting in place important tools for the detection and disruption of harmful activity against Britain. What sign do you think that shows to the rest of the world, and in particular to those in Georgia? Will this help you? Will this measure help you?
I don't know whether it is going to help us directly, but it's certainly something that is very positive, because the more people realize what is happening, the sooner we will see a real strategy. And I've been talking to the Europeans about that also, that I think that this strategy of propaganda and manipulation of elections together deserves to be studied. Even the Georgian example, you were asking me what proofs I have. Our European partners should have been much faster into coming and trying themselves to look at the ways things were really maneuvered and rigged. And because we have also to think how tomorrow electoral observation missions, those that come in advance, what they should look at, how they should prepare themselves, because we're facing completely different elections. And if the whole Western world is not prepared for that, we're going to lose those battles because we'll be naive. We'll be looking at all forms of rigging elections and not at the new ones and the new possibilities to really affect the minds and the decisions of the voters.
Afra. Oh, wait. Do you have something?
Can I come in just
no,
off?
No, we'll have Blair and then Afra. Is that all right?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Just while we're talking about the impact of disinformation, Amedi TV, one of the main propaganda organs of the GD government, I dipped into their feed today and it was full of some of the things you've been describing, blaming Georgia for its own invasion by Russia, cheerleading on the attacks on peaceful protesters, laying the groundwork for banning the opposition. I think people at home in the UK would be surprised to know that that television station is owned and operated in London. And I wonder if you have a view on that and on what the UK should do about the fact that so much of that disinformation and propaganda is emanating from the city that we are sitting in today.
Well, I think you know what you should do.
Do you want to expand on that, President Zurabishvili?
Well, I think that as a president, I never talk directly on sanctions that have to be taken by this or that country against this or that personality. I don't think it's my role. But as a policy, I can certainly say that sanctions, if they are well directed and they concern these very central core issues that are freedom of information, that are the judges that are edicting these sentences that are completely coming out of nowhere, these policemen that are perjuring themselves and providing proofs of something that doesn't exist. Those should be the categories that should be under the threat of sanctions. And another thing that I can say on sanctions, if that's what you want to hear of me, is that I think that until now the sanctions are not used correctly. Because sanctions that are just punishing sanctions, yes, they please to a certain degree the protest population. They say, okay, we have been heard, but they don't serve their ultimate purpose. What should be done is to link these sanctions in a stick and carrot policy of conditionality. If you do this and that, you revoke a number of decisions, number of laws, you set new elections, which is the only way, not because we want new elections necessarily and the opposition wants it, but because it's the only way out of a political crisis that is now lasting for 5 months and is paralyzing the country. So you set a date for new elections, you revoke a number of laws and you liberate prisoners, and then we can start talking about lifting some of the sanctions or putting Georgia back on the map and on the card of of the contacts and partnerships with our European and Western countries. If you don't do it, then you will have a new set of sanctions which will be this and that and address this and that person. That's the way to make those sanctions part of a policy. And if I have one, both a request and a criticism to all our friends that have been so supportive of Georgia all over these years, is that we need more of a policy and less reactive measures. Reactive measures, nice statements are fine, but a policy, a coherent, consistent policy is needed very much. And you shouldn't forget that Georgia, it is the Black Sea coast. It is the link between Europe, the Black Sea, and Central Asia. If a country knows the transit role of Georgia more than anybody else, it's Great Britain. You were here at the time when you were really controlling the road to India and to the east.
All right. Well, before we get into all of that, we could really be here all day. Let me move on to Afra.
Yeah, I just want thank you so much for your answers so far. I just wanted to focus a bit on the disinformation that we have been discussing, and you talked about the war in Ukraine being a turning point for the Georgia Dream Party, and I just wondered how your perception of disinformation over the time of your presidency has perhaps changed. Have you seen it becoming more acute, and was the war in Ukraine also a turning point for that?
Before that, still 212, and during the time of my presidency, I would say that the turning point was the end of 21 and beginning of 22. And that's when they started in official speeches by Mr. Ivanishvili, by the parliamentarians of the Georgian Dream. They started treating our partners as enemies. Russians, they were not mentioning anymore that they were occupying our territories. They were not criticizing them for the aggression in Ukraine, or very softly, or where they really had to and could not do otherwise. So all of this propaganda, and then it became, I would say, beginning 2022 and mid-2022, it became very aggressive against our patrons, accusing them of everything that went wrong in Georgia, that to impose their own values against the identity of the Georgian church, and so on and so forth. You can find all the things that you hear in Russia repeated here, not very ingeniously, by the way, but they were repeated to such an extent, and through televisions like Imedi, like the public channel. In the public channel, I had the utmost difficulties to have interviews while being president, despite the fact that it's in their own charter that they have to do it, because they had become really a pro-governmental media. So the situation of the media had already deteriorated very early, and so reaching people outside of the capital, outside of those that use social networks, became more and more difficult, and it was the official governmental propaganda, which was the same as Russian propaganda, that was reaching more and more people over these last 2.5 years.
So, I mean, thinking about those kind of the challenges with trying to get your message across or communicate what you want to, did you feel you had any tools to counter the disinformation that was being put out? And thinking now about the Georgian Dream Party, if they're amplifying these disinformation messages, how possible is it for others to combat that disinformation when there's just no political will to tackle it?
Well, now we're past disinformation because they are showing who they are. The number of repressive laws, the number of decisions they take, the way they torture people in prison or mistreat them. Yesterday, a woman politician was taken to a police station to be put naked when she was not even fully, properly, she was not under arrest or anything. She was just provisionally detained. All of that becomes known by we're a small country, so the word of mouth works also very well. Mm-hmm. So all these things that they are committing now today are really playing against their propaganda. So it's reality that is really challenging today the propaganda. But we need to be supported. We need to have support for regional media that are very courageous, are doing an extraordinary job, and they're reaching down to the families and to the small cities, but they need support. They are using very small monies, but even that small money is today very restricted, and they are under pressure. One of their most famous journalists is in prison, has been hunger striking. It's again a woman, and she is continuing her fight, and that is what represents today Georgia.
The evidence you've just given is very shocking, horrible to hear. But can I just underline what Afra's asked, because I think it's for us sitting here in the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, in our inquiry, we're looking at disinformation and we're trying to draw lessons, and in particular, what lessons Britain should learn, or the Foreign Office in particular should learn. So what more could we have done to have countered the disinformation before we get to the horrible stories that you're now telling us? You know, was there more that we could have done, and and do we learn lessons from that to help and apply those lessons in other countries that may be suffering from that disinformation, and indeed we may suffer it ourselves in the future? Is that yeah? Sorry, Afra, let me just have it. I'm going to ask the question again and just see if there's anything else that you were able to tell us.
What else could have been done? I think, again, the direct training to make people understand how disinformation works. I have seen many of that type of programs on different Western channels, European channels. We didn't have any of that in the main channels. So that's very important to learn how you identify what are the fake news. Social networks are very used in Georgia, so they could be more used by some organization outside of the country that know how to track disinformation and can reach through social networks Georgia. One very important initiative that I've heard from, I think it was a Czech president, if I'm not mistaken, was that European countries should take replace Voice of America and Radio Liberty. That is very important initiative. I don't know how Great Britain can figure in that, but very clearly information is where the next war is going to be had. And together with information, again, I think that preparing, preventing, everything that has to do with elections. Another thing I didn't mention was that technology was used in our elections in a very disruptive way. And the company that carried out this technology equipment was the same that was used, that was operating in Venezuela. So that we didn't know at the time. Some of our partners probably knew these things better than us, but did not felt that it was something that needed to be observed or controlled. I think from now on, in all the elections that are under Russian pressure, directly or indirectly, there should be a very strict scrutiny of all the different means and methods that they can use.
Yes. Emma, do you want to ask anything further on that? Oh, I'm sorry, I think I've just covered it for you. Phil. Sorry, didn't realise that.
Thank you, Madam President. I suppose on the British Foreign Affairs Committee here, we often think about what unique role can the United Kingdom play. I suppose in high-level diplomacy, what do you think the UK can do to support Georgian democracy and territorial sovereignty?
Well, Georgian democracy, I think it's attention, if possible, this policy of conditionality I've described, which I'm not guaranteeing that it will give a result, but which I see as the only outside pressure that can add to the pressure that is on the authorities, coming from the economy, coming from the finances, and coming from the street protests. It's a triangle under which they're going to be with isolation and where this conditionality could play a role. But beyond that, there is a wider strategy. I think that Georgia should be seen as part of the wide European security. We are, after all, the other face of Ukraine. If Russia wins partly some territories in Ukraine, has a very shaky ceasefire, whatever will happen, we are the other. We are really the southern part of Russia. And if Russia is stopped, well or not well, on some line in Ukraine, it's not to be able, without any cost and so rapidly, 1 year after Georgia acceded to the candidate status, to be able to grab Georgia. So that's part of a challenge for our partners, and it's a challenge for European security on the wider scale. It is, again, the Black Sea, And if you have Georgia introducing China on the shores of the Black Sea, I don't think that as a whole, European security is well served. And another issue, but probably it's not an immediate one, but when times come for real peace talk with Russia on occupied territories, there will be no real ever peace with Russia that does not include all occupied territories of Russia. Because for that long, Russia will not consider itself as a normal country that has borders that it has to defend and it has to respect. It will always feel inside itself this imperialistic urge, which will translate to any of its neighbors where it will be the weakest point. So occupied territories are not just one or the other or the third one, it's all the occupied territories because it's a reflection of the way Russia sees itself in the world.
And thank you for those comments about wider European security. I just wanted to ask, to what extent do you have concerns that Russia uses Georgia as a jurisdiction to propagate the evasion of economic sanctions that have been put on the Russian regime? And if you think that is a concern, is there more that you believe the UK, the EU, the US can do to support your country to prevent that evasion?
I mean, to a certain extent, you've given us some of the part of the answer earlier, but I think it's important to ask it as a straight question, just to see if there was anything that you hadn't said earlier to complete it, I think.
So I think there is a risk that Georgia becomes a grey zone, and that is, of course, a challenge for everyone. And there are many means in which those countries, for instance, the United States, have always been very active on the borders, the customs of Georgia, exactly for that, to be able to control not only at that time the sanctions, but the trafficking. So that could be reinforced, and that should be a pressure again put on the ruling party.
Yes, thank you. Unless anybody has any other questions, I've just got one more, which is, what are your hopes for Georgia? What are your hopes for Georgia in the future?
I think my hopes for Georgia are the ones for which I came back from France, where my family had emigrated, which is to help and support Georgia's European path, democratic path, and stable future. I think that it is shared by the very vast majority of the Georgian population, so I'm confident that whatever the ups and downs and the very difficult position we are in today, the Georgian population will manage to have its way, as it has always supported its own strong independence and its own way in the wider Europe.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you for taking the time to answer our questions today. And if anything occurs to you after this session, if there's anything that you think that perhaps we also should have known about, would you be kind enough to write to the committee with any further information that you might have? And it's been a great pleasure meeting you.
We have just created a coordinating body of the opposition, pro-European opposition parties, and that's one of our decision, which is to send information in our name. It was coming to you in different ways, I know, in our name, to send it to our major partners so that the information gets there on time and in a consolidated manner. So thank you to all very much.
No, thank you.
It was very
thank
important. I hope I can, one of these days, come physically to meet with you.
It will be very nice to meet you in person at some stage, I hope. Okay, all right, thank you very much.